Greetings, fellow Who-gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. This week, the first photos from the James Webb Space Telescope were released, and as many of you have already pointed out all over social media, yes, that 13 billion year old photograph of the universe looks very, very, very similar to the season's 18 through 23 opening credits. I have a new email address, Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature at Gmail, and I've received my first ever listener email. This letter comes to us from Los Angeles, Carl Rosemead. Dear Doctor Who Literature, your podcast has become a must-listen. Jason represents the best of Doctor Who fandom. Gee, Carl, that's really nice of you. I'll keep reading. He also represents the worst of Doctor Who fandom. Seriously. Well, I guess Carl gives with one hand and takes away with the other. He goes on to write, can't you just have Fraser Gregory read all your scripts for you? That voice, brah, just saying. But seriously, love the pod, love the insights, love the guests. Keep them coming. Add more Fraser, please. That was Carl in Rosemead. Thanks, Carl. Well, that email did not end where I thought it was going to end based on the beginning. But yes, we are going to have more Fraser. I promise. Meanwhile, today we're looking at Doctor Who and the Mutants, and joining me from the Trap One podcast is my friend Denise Sutton. She is one of the friendliest and most polite interviews I've ever had. It was a joy to speak to her. And honestly, maybe I should have her read my scripts from now on. That might keep Carl and Rosemead happy. Let's get to it. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. Very happy to have a first-time guest today. Well, first time on Doctor Who Literature, but she and I have worked together on the Trap One podcast before. Denise, welcome to the program.
Hi, Jason, and thank you very much for having me.
Great to record with you again. You and I have worked on a couple of Trap Ones in the past. We did a instant reaction to one of the Doctor Who Flux episodes last year, for example.
Yes, that's right.
I can post links to those in the show notes. What's interesting is I think you are based on where you live, you are the fifth different country that I've recorded with since I started this show, because I've had guests in the United States and England and Canada and Australia. You, I believe, are my first guest from Norway, or living in Norway, I should say.
And I may well be the only one. Or there aren't many people who know Doctor Who in Norway. It's not been shown to a great extent. So I live in a country where children grow up not knowing what Daleks are, if you can imagine that. You do see a few people around and about occasionally. It has been shown on the BBC cable channel that we have here, BBC Brit, but they're not showing the recent episodes. So, yes, it's a largely Doctor Who free zone here, apart from me and my house.
I had a similar experience growing up in the mid-1980s in the US. Obviously, we had Doctor Who here because we had airings on PBS, and the novelizations sold very well at my local bookstore. But it was a very niche show, so if you didn't know about it, you didn't know anything about it, and if you knew about it, you were a big fan.
Yes, so you got all the good conventions in the 80s, though, didn't you? Because you could lure all the good guests over.
Yeah, John Nathan Turner was coming back and forth between England and the US when arguably he should have been at his office taking better care of the show, but we certainly do have a lot of memorable convention stories from over here thanks to him. So I guess it was the case of you got to take the rough with the smooth. Is there a convention scene in Norway, or do you have to go back to England in order to get to conventions and see the?
They have the occasional sort of Comic Con kind of thing, but not really, no. If I want to go to a convention with guests that I actually know who they are and want to meet them, then I have to go to the UK. Yeah.
How long have you been in Norway?
I moved over in 2002, so 20 years this year. But of course, then Doctor Who had been off the air for quite a long time, and the TV movie was becoming a dim memory. So I assumed Doctor Who was something that wasn't going to come back and wasn't going to happen anymore, and was just a nice memory from my childhood. And I'm very, very happy to be wrong about that.
When Doctor Who came back in 2005, there was no US broadcaster for about a year until our sci fi channel got the license to show the Christopher Eccleston season. But it was difficult to watch that first season of Doctor Who here in the States. You had to use various illicit means of technology.
Mm,
You're in
yes.
Norway in 2005 when the show comes back. Did you have any trouble watching the episodes as they came out?
Well, that was impossible. It was a bit of a strange blip because the main no, the main TV channel, for some reason, they did have the first Christopher Eccleston season, and they showed it sometime after it had been on in the UK. But yes, I had to buy DVDs. There wasn't when they came out. I couldn't really see anything else before then. Um, and then the BBC started iPlayer online in about 2007, and a short time after that, I figured out what a VPN was for, and
Ah,
so so I've been all right after that. But that's strictly entre nous.
yes, you, me, and my little audience. Fortunately, there's not enough of an audience for this to have any legal ramifications for any of my guests. Rest assured.
Well, they always ask you on BBC iPlayer, do you have a TV license? And I tick yes. I have a TV license. It's a Norwegian TV license, but they're not specifying.
Well, as somebody who spent the last 25 years in the legal profession, you are answering the question technically correct, and that is the best kind of correct there is.
It's the only correct I know. So, and anyway, if the BBC saw my DVD collection, you know, I have paid lots and lots of years worth of license fees.
Same here. I buy all the DVDs as they come out and more than. So I certainly have no compunction about using whatever alternate means of technology I can to watch an episode a few hours early. But since I have some stories in multiple DVD formats, I think I've owned or paid for Spearhead from Space 4 or 5 different times if you include the novelization.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that point now, aren't we?
Absolutely. As I like to do with my first time guests, take a moment, Denise, and tell us how did you become a Doctor Who fan in the first place?
Okay, well, I've watched it all my life. I mean, I heard you on one of your other podcasts, or I gather it's one of your things, dissing the Dominators. That was actually the show that was being broadcast when I was born. So that is my birth story that you are disrespecting there, and I'm not saying you don't have a point.
Oh my word!
But my mum figured out quite early that if she plonked me in front of the TV and it was Star Trek or it was Doctor Who, I'd be fine. I'd be absolutely engrossed. So she just left me there, and it babysat me through my very tiny years. And growing up as a kid in the 70s in the UK, Doctor Who, Saturday night TV, all your friends watched it, and you all sat around and discussed it, and you played it in the playground. And as I got to be about 10, 11 years old, I began to realise how really, really good it was. And when Peter Davison became the Doctor, I think that's when my lifetime appreciation became a bit of an obsession.
That's about the same age that I was. I was 11 years old when my obsession began. And I should take a moment because my audience now is much larger than it was when I first started talking about the Dominators. So Fraser Gregory, who was one of my uh, repeat guests and will be back on again soon, is one of the few fans that I know for whom the Dominators is one of his favorite stories.
Oh my word!
So it used to be that anytime I would make a reference to the Dominators anywhere, he would immediately jump in on Twitter with red klaxon emojis talking about the Dominators alert. So it's become a recurring gag that I will just talk about the Dominators because I know Fraser is out there and listening and enjoys hearing the story name checked. So he last week accused me of running a Dominators themed podcast that occasionally talks about the books. So I think this
Hmm.
is probably the 11th straight week that I've talked about the Dominators in some form or another. And you yourself have alluded to it's perhaps not your favorite story of all time. Do you recall if there was a specific story or a specific moment that made you a fan?
Um, I think, well, that made me a real fan when I sort of realised what an influence it had on my life. And I think it was I mean, I loved Romana too. And I think she's probably, for the age that I was when Lalla Ward was the companion, she was quite an influence on me. You know, she was stylish and elegant and funny and clever and all of the things I'll never be, but you've got to have something to aspire to. And then, you know, the change to season 18 from season 17, you know, new producer, new title sequence, you knew it was Tom Baker's last story. And also, and this is also quite important, I was not allowed to watch it at that
What?
time because on the other side, at the same time, Buck Rogers in the 25th century. We didn't have video, there was no iPlayer, none of that malarkey. And my dad and my brother, there was some girl in Buck Rogers in the 20th century that they thought was quite attractive. So obviously, they outvoted me and my mum, who was in the kitchen making dinner at that time in the evening anyway. So I didn't get to see, I don't think, the Leisure Hive, Meglos, Full Circle, State of Decay, kicked back in Warrior's Gate. I mean, wow, what a story to go back into.
That is a gorgeous story. Although, if you've missed the first serials before that, you might have been a little short on context. But with the possible exception of Meglos, every one of those stories is an all time great in my book. So that's a really unfortunate season to have missed in favor of Buck Rogers.
I have made up for lost time since. So, although I didn't actually get to see State of Decay until I think the 1990s, because I mean, Full Circle had been repeated. I think Leisure Hive and Meglos got a repeat as well, or anyway, I saw them somehow, and then that was it. And then had the long hiatus between Logopolis and Castrovalva, and in that time, yeah, I morphed into a Doctor Who fan for real, full time.
I guess if you're going to have to pick between the two shows, you were better off watching Buck Rogers in the moment because that is not a show that's had a very long afterlife. So if you missed it in 1980, 81, there's probably a fair guess that you never would ever have seen those episodes again. Whereas, at least with Doctor Who, you can now purchase those missing episodes in multiple formats.
Yes, can and have. So yeah, that was it. It wasn't easy being an 11-year-old girl in 1980s Caversham.
I do want to say that you're selling yourself short. You are certainly the Ramana 2 of Trap 1, and we are certainly delighted to have you on there as a regular. So
Oh, I love it so much. It's just a cozy chat with some great friends, and you know, just to be so positive about the show we love when we see so much negativity out there sometimes.
there is a lot of negativity on Twitter, even now with the not my doctor people. However, at least on the corner of Twitter that is reserved for Trap One and like-minded podcasters. We generally keep it very positive, and any critique is always good-natured and reasoned. So if you just find your tribe on Twitter, a lot of the negativity can be
Well,
avoided.
that's right. And I've been very, very lucky to do that. I think because I haven't been on Twitter that much and I haven't focused on it so much, but I have got some great friends there, a lot of whom that I met sort of a little over 10 years ago, where we would all do a group watch of a Doctor Who story. We'd all like, yeah, let's watch Earthshock tonight. And we would do that. And because there weren't that many of us, maybe 15 or 20 or something, it kind of worked. It's not like when you're all watching the Eurovision Song Contest or something and there's thousands of people trying to watch it. But met a lot of people, made a lot of really good friends among that started off with these group watches that we used to have back when Twitter was young and small and manageable.
So that was an experience that was kind of lost to me in the States. I really never had a chance to do a group watch until years went by. I did have a couple of friends who watched the show, although they gave it up much sooner than I did. And I would try to show it to my non-fan friends to get them interested, usually with an utter lack of success. I think the first time that I ever watched any Doctor Who story with multiple people that I knew, I mean, unless you're counting sitting in a video room at a convention in the mid 1990s, the first time that I sat down with a group of friends to watch any story was Parting of the Ways, which aired the night before my wedding. So I had a bunch of
Wow.
friends in town. I had one table at the reception for Doctor Who fans. So we all gathered together at 2 in the morning, literally, to watch Parting of the Ways. That was my real first group watching Doctor Who experience, I think.
I think with me, it was because I joined the Doctor Who Appreciation Society in the UK, along with my good friend Maria, and we we were 15 years old, and we went along to this bloke's house called Dave, and he got out. He had the existing episodes of the 10th Planet, and it was like, wow, because you read the novelization, but you just don't ever imagine that you will get to see these stories. It's absolutely incredible.
That's got to be a very exciting moment, though, to think that this story is lost forever, and then to be able to watch the surviving 3 episodes. That's. I remember the first time that I became aware that 10th Planet or parts of it existed, and I was able to get an nth generation copy of the videotape. I was literally floating home with that VHS tape in my hands. It was a
Mm.
great moment.
Yes, I mean for me, because there was a room full of people. I'd never met any of them before. They were all quite nice, and we sat down, and you just put the video in the cassette, and didn't no introduction or anything. So you just had to figure out what you were watching, and it was like, this is 10th Planet. Oh, and it's still wondrous when we get a reconstruction as well. When I get a new DVD or Blu-ray of the latest reconstruction, that's always a special moment as well.
Yeah, I hosted the Trap One recently for the Galaxy 4 animation, which was just really a wonderful job, gorgeous work on the visuals. I was very happy to have that. I have not kept up with all of the latest animated recons. I have not seen Evil of the Daleks or Web of Fear, which has a new version of Episode 3 out. So that is on my to buy list.
Yes, I haven't got the new version of the Web of Fear. I haven't bought that yet, but no, I've ordered the Abominable Snowman, and I really loved Evil of the Daleks, and I did do the Trap One podcast about that as well, because got some very special memories from my other half. He isn't a huge Doctor Who fan, but he loves Daleks, and he's a bit older than me. He's going to be 60 this year, and so he can actually remember watching Evil of the Daleks as a little boy.
Oh wow, that must have been an amazing experience to watch that live. It's a foundational story in so many ways because it introduces Victoria, and it's got a very intriguing use of the Daleks. Plus, it was the Daleks quote unquote final appearance. Plus, it ends with what was I going to say? Anyway, I think it was the end of the season, so you're left dangling once the final episode goes out. So I can't imagine what it was like to watch that live. It's got to be a great experience being able to see the animated version so many years after the original was lost.
Yes, yeah, he loved it, especially the scene with the Daleks with the human factor. That was something that really had stuck in his mind as a childhood memory. So it always makes me happy when it's a Pertwee reconstruction because they make my other half very happy indeed.
So, what's your other half's favorite era of the show?
Well, it's Patrick Troughton because that was what he grew up with between up until he was 7, 8 years old, and then unfortunately his parents were quite old fashioned, I guess, and they didn't really understand how important Doctor Who was to him. And so when Patrick Troughton became John Pertwee, they didn't. Nobody explained to him why, and he just thought that, he just stopped watching it because the person that Patrick Troughton's Doctor he thought of as a friend, and that friend was gone, and it was never replaced or it was never explained to him what had happened. And it breaks my heart, actually, to think about this because he could have been a Doctor Who fan too, as well, and he was hurt and it wasn't explained to him. And I think that modern parents, our generation who have become parents, they're much better at it because they've learned from their previous people's mistakes.
Yeah, I would say that I'm a lot more engaged with my child's TV watching habits than my parents were with me back in the 80s or 70s, but it's a different world now. I think we've learned from the lessons of the previous generation. It's funny that you mentioned the Pertwee era, though, because that's the era that we're discussing today. But before we segue into that, we've talked about how you discovered the show. We've talked about your experiences watching it over the years. I do want to bring up the novelizations. How did you come across the novelizations for the first time, and what role do those play in your fandom?
Well, I think I'd always seen them around. I mean, I had friends who had them, and I'd got them from the library from time to time. But then when I decided that I was going to take the oath and become a proper Doctor Who fan, then I started buying the books. And I was at a school which was just around the corner from a bookshop called the London Street Bookshop. And me and some friends used to go in there after school quite a lot because it had a ZX Spectrum that you could play on. I'm
Right.
really dating myself here, aren't I? And of course, they had the Doctor Who books, and when they had new editions out, they had like a little cardboard display thing, and there they were, and it was like, oh, I'll buy that one, and I pounce on it, and they were £1.25, and I think my pocket money was £1.50, so I could afford one a week if I didn't have too many sweets and things on top of that.
I was in a similar boat because my babysitting salary for my kid sister was $3 a week, and the Target books in the States were $2.95 US. So I also was on a book a week ration.
Yes, I don't think I bought one every week, but then it was an easy birthday present or Christmas present to buy for me. Or, of course, you've got like the school fates and the jumble sales and the second-hand bookshops where you can find things as well. So it was quite easy to build up a collection because, second-hand books were like 10p sometimes, and you could really get a good score if you struck lucky.
Do you recall what was your first book or first books?
I think my first one was the novelisation of State of Decay because I was drawn to it because it had the new neon logo on it, which is still my favourite logo. And I knew it was a story I hadn't seen, so because of the whole Buck Rogers thing. So I think I took that home and I probably read half of it by the time I got off the bus. So that was my first one. And then my second one, I think, was Enemy of the World, which my brother bought me for my birthday. But and it just went on from there. I can tell you my copy of the Mutants. If I bought my first Doctor Who book in early 1982, this one I got in December 1982 because I wrote it in the front.
Oh, wow.
And yes, so I don't think it could have been a present, I suppose, but I really can't remember. But it's a 1982 imprint of the 1977 Target original.
Now, my copyright page says that I have the 1984 edition, which makes sense because I started collecting the books in early 85, so those would have been the books arriving in the US. My copy says that there were two reprints of the Mutants in 1982, which means what I have is a fifth edition. Do you know if yours in 1982 would have been the first or the second printing?
Well, it says text of book copyright 1977, reprinted 1979, reprinted 1982, so I guess it's the first.
Because there was a discussion of that on the Doctor Who Targets Facebook page last week. I think it was Dale Santos, who's been on this show before and is a prolific Target collector. Notice that he has lots of copies that say reprinted 1982 twice, but he doesn't have any copies that just say reprinted 1982. But you are, I think, one of the rare people that actually has the first of the two printings rather than the second of the two printings for that year.
I probably shouldn't have written my name and the date in the front of it then, should I? What a silly sausage.
That may have taken about 30 pence off of the eBay value if you were to ever sell the books.
As if that's going to happen. I mean, I do seem to have 3 copies of Doctor Who: A Celebration, so I suppose 1 or 2 of those might find their way onto eBay at some point, but it's not my first priority.
No, I'm going to be keeping my books until the bitter end, and I have written so much in my copies over the years: cliffhanger marks, story codes, sometimes cast lists. I didn't go the full Conrad and put illustrations in my copy of Planet of the Daleks, but I do have a lot of markers of my own. Do you put any particular markings in the mutants other than your name and the date of acquisition?
I think for a while I had some little holographic heart stickers, so some of mine have got holographic hearts on them, but
Oh,
just tiny little ones, top right hand corner.
that certainly expresses your emotional fondness for the story, I'm sure.
Mm.
What is your opinion on the Pertwee era in general? I know I certainly have made no secret that it's absolutely one of my favorite eras of the show. And when I was doing my pilgrimage last year, when the COVID lockdown was still at its height, and I got through the entirety of the Pertwee era in 60 days, it just reaffirmed for me how well made this era of the show is, and what luck we have that we have all these great actors together who had such fondness for one another, and it shows up on camera.
Yes, it's a great ensemble piece. It really is, and in a way, it's almost repertory as well because you get people like Michael Wisher coming back again and again, playing various villains in different makeup. But I think if you like 60s and 70s British drama anyway, the Pertwee era is a prime example of that. You can look at the John Pertwee era alongside things like Callan, alongside things like the Sweeney, and you can see, it's the same world, it's the same intensity of the storytelling. It's the 70s was a golden age for television in the UK, and the John Pertwee era, absolutely a very, very good example of that.
So you've been talking about your very fond memories of the Pertwee era, and I think we're certainly on the same page there. In terms of the novelization of the Mutants, which you've presumably read at least a few times over the years, what was it like going back to it now, reading it here in 2022?
Well, I mean, I think what the last time I read it, I had never actually seen the Mutants on TV. So now, of course, I've seen the program several times as well. But it was one of the novelizations that I remember being absolutely engrossed in when I was a kid. I thought it sounded like a really beautiful and interesting story. Um, Other examples of this are also Keys of Marinus, which again is perhaps a little bit disappointing in the execution when you finally get to see it, and Planet of the Daleks, which is, of course, brilliant on screen or on the page. Um, but then the Mutants. Sorry, that was my cat leaping off the bed. Um, that was Rambo.
I
Um,
couldn't hear your cat because my smudge is right under me trying to jump on my keyboard, so my cat drowned out your cat, at least on my headset.
yeah, Rambo came to join me for a purr. I was going to record in the spare room, but he was stretched out on the bed in there, and he's a big lad. But he's gone to sit in the hall now, so but he was purring and having some strokes and things. But
I have Smudge literally walking on my keyboard now, so if there's any recording disturbance, that would be Smudge's fault
this time, yes,
this time. Uh,
yeah, I've got home. I'm working from home the next few days, and I'm sure Rambo will help me out with that. But, yes, so on TV, of course, the mutants came in between the Curse of Peladon and the Sea Devils. So it was bookmarked by some pretty stiff competition.
yeah,
Um,
both of those are hard to beat.
and but when I finally saw the real TV version of the story on UK Gold in the 1990s, yeah, it it didn't really live up to the expectations. I was really looking forward to seeing it, having read the novel, and hoping that somehow the effects would live up to what happened in my imagination in the cathedral like caves and the transformation of Kai and such things. But of course, when you read any book and then later there's a TV version or a movie of the book, somehow it's rarely as good as it is in your imagination. But so that's not unique to Doctor Who, and it's not unique to the mutants.
And regrettably, nothing really dates faster than special effects. So if a story is reliant on a particular visual effect, but the story is now literally 50 years old, like the Mutants is, you're bound to be disappointed in the visuals. But it's funny how what you say tracks so much with my own experience. I had the author of Keys of Marinus, the novelization, on a month or so ago,
Mm.
and he was not very fond of that particular story or book compared to the other ones that he wrote. For me, though, I always remember getting Keys of Marinus at my first convention in 1985 when I was 11 going on 12, and I realized quickly that I was possibly the only 11-year-old boy in the city of New York who enjoyed reading courtroom dramas, which is what the last half of Marinus is. And that certainly, along with Stones of Blood having aired on TV earlier that month, was a very outsized influence in my eventual career choice. So I have much fonder memories of Keys of Marinus than the person who actually wrote the novelization. And I know that I also would have read The Mutants before I saw it on TV. It was difficult watching the Pertwee stories when they first hit PBS in the States in 1985 because they were airing at 11 p.m. in movie format. And I just, at that age, I wasn't the kind of kid who was staying up until 1:30 in the morning to catch the end event.
Yeah, that's a big ask.
I missed a lot of those, and I had to wait until they came back around in 1987, by which time I'd already seen the novelization or read the novelization multiple times. I distinctly recall being disappointed in the way the mutants looked compared to the way that Terrence Dix wrote it, because again, some of the direction is very choppy. The part for cliffhanger, especially in movie format, doesn't make any sense. And at that age, I was getting, at 13 or 14, I was a little more older and a little more cynical about my TV. But every time I go back to the book, it reminds me of what this story is and how I should be judging it on the dialogue and the politics and the plot rather than whatever visual choices Christopher Barry had foisted upon him in 1972. So in that sense, the novelization is like the pure expression of the story, and it's really what we should be celebrating and focusing on.
Yes, I mean, the sparkling dialogue between Joe and the Doctor, that's all there. And I mean, they had such a great rapport. And I mean, it's part of the, like I was saying, the 1970s drama, which can be a little bit gritty and a little bit political. So, it's the end of Earth's empire. They basically want to have a closing down sale and go home. And similar again with Frontier in Space, what is Earth going to look like as a political entity when it gets out into space? And why do they have to go out? Well, because the planet is just completely wrecked, overpopulated, overpolluted, and they want to find something decent somewhere else to live, but it's expensive and it's labor intensive, and the natives don't like it, and who can blame them?
It's funny how the politics of the mutants is so timely because it is a story that is about climate change, and it's a story about how the aggressive application of technology can have a profound effect on people's lives and health. And also, it has a lot to say about colonialism and imperialism and segregation. Now, here in the States, you've been watching the January 6th House subcommittee hearings, and you're certainly aware of the prevailing political winds going on in my country right now, where in many states that are controlled by one particular political party, it is now illegal to teach some of the lessons that the mutants is trying to give us. So I think that makes the story even more valuable today, much more so than the special effects, because it is still touching a raw nerve. If you were to introduce this book into a classroom in a state like Texas or some other bright red electoral state, teachers might lose their jobs over this book, which is horrifying to think about, but it shows you how strong the messaging is.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I know what you're talking about there, and yes, there is some CRT in here. There's no two ways about it. Um, but, I mean, moving aside from the politics, which is often built into Doctor Who, particularly in that era. It's so many times where John Pertwee's Doctor has to have an argument with a government minister, or there's a decent government minister, but there's a bureaucrat or a scientist who's not playing ball, and it's all about diplomacy and politics and trying to negotiate with these people and come to some kind of agreement rather than just shooting monsters with ray guns, which people think science fiction is about, but it really isn't. So yes, there's a lot of interesting moments, and yes, so he was given the black character Cotton, played by Rick James. He was given the line about the marshal hunting down the mutant natives, describing it as trophy hunting.
Right, that is a very telling comment. And when I joined Rec Arts Doctor Who in the 90s, the thing to do was make fun of Rick James's acting in the story. And the Part 5 cliffhanger line is often derided. And I even made reference to it last week in the teaser for this episode. It is not fair to do that. And I think people who make fun of his performance are kind of missing the plot. He needs to be in that story as a sign of Earth's colonial past and what a horrible price you pay for imperialism. And there were just so
Yes,
few black characters in that era of the show. I think in the entirety of the Pertwee era, there were only two in 5 years. Lewis Mahoney, who had a big part.
that's true. Although I think Doctor Who has always been quite groundbreaking. I mean, there have always been people of colour in Doctor Who, um, and some of them have had absolutely brilliant, well-written parts, like her name temporarily escapes me, but the character in Enemy of the World, very strong black female character.
Right. Carmen Monroe was the actress playing Faria. She was terrific.
And one of the astronauts in the 10th Planet was a black guy, of course.
Earl Cameron, who lived to be like 101 years old.
Yes. So, but yes, I mean, Rick James, I sort of got the impression there was a touch of the Beryl Reid in Earthshocks about him, in that maybe although he was also in an episode of Blake Seven, apparently, he was mainly a stage actor. He died in 2018. And I think maybe he didn't fully understand the dialogue that he was delivering. And I think there might also have been something with the character playing Stubbs, who was supposed to be his best mate, but they hadn't really developed the warmth and camaraderie, and they were acting against each other rather than acting together. So I think maybe he needed a little bit more direction. Maybe he didn't get as much support from his closest fellow performer that he should have got, but he does look a bit baffled quite a lot of the time.
And that's another advantage you get from the novelization, because I think you and I were both coming from the book first. When you're
Yes,
reading the book in your head, there's no bad direction, there's no bad acting. You can picture these two as they were supposed to be, actual friends, and any of the poorly directed performances or negative implications on TV are not going to come through in the book. So I recall being disappointed that Cotton and Stubbs on TV were not as awesome as they were in my imagination, which
yes.
is why it's nice to go back and read the book and see that.
They should have been like Jago and Lightfoot, you know?
Right, and if Stubbs had survived the story, you could have had a decades worth of Big Finish spin-offs the way that Jago and Lightfoot got. Right. Huh.
But yes, and then you've got the Marshal, of course, who is a completely repellent character. I think didn't we podcast together about the Pirate Planet?
Yes, we did.
And I think the Marshal wanted to be the pirate captain when he grew up.
Of course, the problem is the pirate captain was secretly a good guy underneath it all, or at least had a
Mm.
good motive, and he has a sort of redemption at the end, whereas the marshal doesn't get it. Well, we've talked a little bit about U.S. politics. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Paul Whitson Jones, as he appears in 1972, very much looks the way that horrible U.S. hate radio host Rush Limbaugh used to look in the 1990s. So when I was watching the Mutants on PBS in the 90s when I was in college, I'm like, wow, that's Rush Limbaugh on screen. And obviously that was unintentional, but it's an interesting rhyme because Rush Limbaugh, the radio host, certainly would have said a lot of things over the years, which the Marshal as a character would have agreed with and parroted and found as words to live by. Although, of course, that's totally an
Yes.
unexpected connotation that might not have worked in England or or other places that were not the U.S.
Well, probably not. I mean, he was just a chubby, mean faced bastard of the old school, if you know what I mean.
Just like Rush Limbaugh.
Like you call the Little Englanders, the people who still believe in empire, still believe in the supremacy of their particular nation or planet. And I mean, John Pertwee's doctor, although he was patrician in a lot of ways, he was a lot more far-sighted than that. He wanted to broaden people's minds and broaden people's ideas about tolerance and acceptance and different species and different races. Not always successfully, of course. Silurians still got blown to pieces, but he was trying to make connections and make peace between people rather than otherwise.
his character is often wrongly described as a Tory or a member of the establishment, whereas I think he's anything but in most of the stories. And especially, it's a feature of Bob Baker and Dave Martin that the villain is almost always a small minded right wing bureaucrat or politician because this is their second story. The first one, Claws of Axos, which we covered here back in episode 31 about a month ago as I'm talking now. The bad guy, well, the antagonist there was Chin, and the third Doctor literally criticizes him for being one of those England for the English people. And now you have the Marshal in their second story, who fulfills much the same purpose, although he's 1,000 years later in time, so he's more of an imperialist than Chin would have been. But it's
Yes.
almost the same character. And then you
Mm.
fast forward to the late 1970s, and you look at the Bob Baker, Dave Martin script for Armageddon Factor. The main antagonist in that story is also called the Marshal, so they brought back the name and made a similar, like-minded, trigger-happy character.
Yes, I think the Marshal in the Armageddon Factor is a lot more complicated, though, and you do end up feeling some sympathy towards him. Whereas this Marshal, he's completely unsympathetic, and his communicator looks like a bicycle pump.
I think it was a bicycle pump, actually, if I
It
recall my
probably was a
DVD.
bicycle pump, yeah. It didn't just look like one. I mean, things cropped up in all sorts of unexpected contexts in Doctor Who in that time, didn't they?
When Gary Russell was speaking at Gallifrey 1 in 2020, right before the pandemic, he was introducing the trailer for the Fury from the Deep DVD animation, which had not come out yet. But he was the producer and overseeing the animation, and he told us a story. I'm positive this is true. That they actually had a sonic screwdriver prop on location for Fury from the Deep, and then somehow the prop got lost. So Patrick Troughton took a whistle, an emergency whistle, off of his life preserver, and he used the whistle as the sonic screwdriver prop on location in that story because they didn't have an actual screwdriver the way that Pertwee would years later. So the Marshall's bicycle pump is probably, again, it's the same kind of found prop that they had to use on short notice because something else fell through.
Yes, I mean you couldn't just make anything from scratch on a 3D printer like they can now. It was they did have to rely on taking household objects and gluing two hair dryers together and calling it a spaceship and things like that. But you did notice if there was something new in the stationery store or something like hologram packing tape or when you had the sort of pink neon coloured plastic clipboards and things like that, and they would appear in Doctor Who, because suddenly this material's available and the props department just seize on it and use it, and it's insignia on uniforms, and it's all sorts of strange things. But you thought, oh yeah, I saw that in W.H. Smith the other week, and now he's got it on his shirt, But
When I posted my Ark in Space episode 32, on my Facebook page last month, that led to a lively conversation among my Facebook friends about the utility of bubble wrap in that story. Because in defense of the Ark in Space in 1975, bubble wrap was still pretty new. And if you spray paint it green and show it on a 13-inch TV set, most folks might not recognize what it is. Whereas
that's
nowadays, of
very
course,
true,
bubble wrap,
actually.
everybody gets bubble wrap multiple times a day through their pandemic shipping, and everyone knows what it is. And you could no longer pass off bubble wrap as a mutating alien monster the way you could in 1975.
I actually remember watching that story at the time, and yeah, it was scary. At the time, spray painted green bubble wrap. I'd never seen anything like it before. Yeah, it worked for me.
And when Ian Marter was writing the novelization, of course, he doesn't write it as bubble wrap. He writes it almost as CGI, as an active force that is constantly
Mm.
moving and churning, which you couldn't do on television in 1975, especially with bubble wrap. But that almost ties into the way that Terrence Dix writes this story. He spares no expense in the text, and I'll read out
Mm.
some examples later in the program. He spares no expense in making fun of the Marshal and mocking the Marshal's thought processes. So Terrence certainly gets and appreciates and enjoys the story's political overtones. And there are points in the story where he doesn't lean into it as much as he did in the Clause of Access book, but when it comes to the Marshal, he never misses a chance to belittle the Marshal as a character.
Yes, I mean, and he's got it coming. There's absolutely no doubt who the bad guy is there. There is some very beautiful writing as well when he's talking about towards the end of the story when the investigator reacts to the reality of the mutant, which previously he thought, well, yes, we should allow these creatures to survive, we should withdraw. But then, as soon as he's in the room with one of these monsters, then he's absolutely on the Marshall side because he is just so scared. And suddenly, a chunky chap with a gun and a plan sounds like the best possible solution.
And I would also point out this is one of the few Doctor Who stories that has a trial sequence in it because you have the Earth investigators hearing in part 6 over the Marshal's experiments on Solos, and it's a very well done cinematic and lively written hearing scene, a courtroom scene, because you have surprise witnesses and twists and turns. And I think it compares favorably to the trial scenes in Keys of Marinus that made such a big impact on me when I was 11 years old. So that's another thing I really enjoy about the Mutants as a book because you get to read all that. Certainly sparked my imagination when I was a kid.
I mean, one thing that struck me about the book is I picked it up, I looked at it, I thought, well, it's just 126 and a half pages, so that's your standard Uncle Terry novel length for a four-parter. And so when I rewatched the story as well, I was a bit surprised to see it's actually a six-parter, and it's really, really been condensed. You know, there isn't a word or a sentence wasted in this.
And he does have to remove some duplicative or cumulative TV dialogue in order to make it fit. And I'll talk about that after the break. But I asked this question of everybody who comes in to discuss a Terrence Dicks book, Denise. So I'm going to ask you as well. In your mind, is this the definitive Terrence Dicks novelization?
With Terrance Dicks, you always knew that you were going to get a story that was as close to the original as it could possibly be. I possibly had a preference for if they could actually get the person who wrote the script, wrote the story, to write the novelization as well. Then, as far as I was concerned, that was the icing on the cake, and there are some excellent examples of that. But you knew with Terrance Dicks, familiar territory, wheezing, groaning sound, similar descriptions for companions and the Doctor, and very, very good descriptive writing because he got Doctor Who. He saw the big picture. He'd been involved with it for so long. He'd novelised so many of the stories and written some of his own. He got it. It felt like he was one of us, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Of all the books that he wrote, though, is this the one where he perhaps adds the most value to the TV scripts and adds the most extra insight? Or do you think, as far as his books go, this is a little more standard, not perhaps as long as some of his other books, not quite maybe as insightful as some of his other books?
You know, I think it's so long since I've read them all. I was probably still a child last time I read most of them that I'm probably not really able to answer that question. I think reading this as an adult, having seen the actual program several times now, it's very, very well written. I mean, these were aimed at children, weren't they? But it doesn't read to me as an adult like a children's book. It's a solid storytelling. It doesn't shirk away from the themes in the story. It touches on the really quite adult questions that the series itself raises.
Well, Denise, I'm going to bring you back in a few months. I have another Terrence Dicks book in mind that I want to discuss with you, and then we can discuss definitive and what you get when Terrence is putting everything he has into a novelization.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so what we want to do now before we wrap it up is I want to play a game with you, Denise, as I do with all of my guests, and we're going to play a game today of 20 questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
I have selected off of the randomizer.net one Doctor Who story from the entire run of the show from 1963 to 2022. I know what the story is, you do not. Using 20 yes or no questions, you are going to try and guess which story it is. The all-time record holder is Simon Hart, because of course
Mm.
Simon, because he got it in 7. Nobody has failed yet, so you have a chance as we start to be my all-time record holder.
Or I can be your first dismal failure.
Let's
Oh.
hope you are not, and I'm
Okay.
positive you will not be. Question number 1.
Is it a 21st century Doctor Who story?
Yes, it most certainly is a 21st century story. Question 2. You're off to a great start.
Okay. Is the Doctor female?
Yes, she is female. We are now at question 3, and you may have this in the next 30 seconds.
I wouldn't be so sure about that. Does she have. Are two of her companions born and raised in Sheffield?
Yes, 2 of her companions in the story are born and raised in Sheffield. Question 4, as we go for the record.
Okay. Is it a historical story?
Uh, yes, it is a historical in the sense that it takes place in the past, so we are now at question 5, and if you get it in the next 2, you will have an all-time and possibly unbeatable record.
Let's see. Does it have royalty in it?
I'm going to just ask, I'm going to have a clarification of that. When you say royalty, do you mean a member of an Earthbound royal family, or do you mean any type of royalty by character name?
I mean Earthbound royal family.
No, it does not have the Earthbound royal family in it. Question 6.
Okay. Let me have a think. Is it set in the United States?
Yes, it is set in the United States. That brings us to question 7. This could tie Simon's record, and I think you're going to do it.
Is it Rosa?
No, it is
No.
not Rosa. Oh.
Dear.
Still, you're going to get it any second now. Question 8.
Let's see. Oh, I'm not doing so well.
Well, there's only 2 TV seasons which fit all the parameters you've given. Very few of those stories are historical set in the States.
Yes.
So I feel like you're teetering on the cusp here. You've almost got it.
Yes, just having a think back down memory lane.
I think there's only one story left that fits all those parameters that you've narrowed it down. You're just gonna come up with that one story name, because I think there's only one left.
Yes, I'm being a bit dim here, I think. Let's see. Is it Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror?
It most certainly is Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. You got it in 8. You were so close. You were close to setting the record. You didn't quite set the record, but you did not fail, and you have one of the best ever showings.
Well, thank you very much for that. I really, really had to rack my brains there. A lot of it gets lost in the slipstream, doesn't it, when you're watching Doctor Who all the time, and particularly when they've got some pretty nifty episode titles. I mean, that doesn't exactly stick in your mind so well, does it?
There have been a couple of stories, especially new series stories, that I've picked out of the randomizer for this show where I didn't remember the story in question, or I needed to pause the recording to go on Wikipedia just to answer some of the guests' questions. But This is a story that was set in my home city, so this is one of
Hmm.
the Jody stories that I know better than others. I'm now going to reload the randomizer for my next guest
Your
and
next victim.
my next victim. Oh, I wish you were here next week to guess the story for next week's 20 questions, but I envy the person who has to guess next week's title. My goodness. So, Denise, where can we find you online, on Twitter, or on other podcasts, or anywhere else out there in the online world of Doctor Who?
Okay, well, I am at Cup of Tea 69 on Twitter. I don't really have the time or the focus to do a lot of other things online. I podcast a lot with the Trap One team, Mark McManus and co. And in a couple of days, we're going to be podcasting about the BBC audio Doctor Who spin off Redacted, which I'm enjoying listening to again at the moment. And a few weeks back, we did a really, really fun podcast about the latest audio annuals release. So we had lots of fun doing that. Always a good
Yeah.
laugh.
The annuals team on Trap One is terrific. You and Conrad and Mark, you guys do a great job talking about the annuals. Always a lot of fun to listen to.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's so easily lost in the mist of time, and they're bringing these stories back to life, and they're even getting like Colin Baker to narrate a story from the 1986 Doctor Who annual, which, you know, it's. I don't think it was ever planned that they would have that kind of legacy, that they would actually be read by the actual Doctor. So 30, 40 years later, it's incredible. So yes, we've had a lot of fun with those. The Dalek annuals, the K9 annual, the Doctor Who audio annuals. I'm also working on something for my blog at the moment, which isn't science fiction related, but one of the things I found with my mum that my mum had was a scrapbook that she'd made in 1953 of Queen Elizabeth II's royal tour of the Commonwealth after her coronation. And
Oh,
so I'm
wow.
going to do a blog about that and put it in some historical context and put up some of the pages. So I'm working towards that at the moment as well.
And where can we find your blog?
There's a link on my Twitter bio. It's a
And I,
WordPress one, the Denise person.
and I will add to that in the show notes. Denise, thanks so much for joining me today. We'll get you back on here real soon now.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was really, really good fun. Thanks, Jason.
Doctor Who and the Mutants. Novelized by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Mutants, teleplay by Bob Baker and Dave Martin, televised in April and May 1972, published in September 1977. A massive shape scuttles out of the darkness and strikes the Earth Overlord down. It is a mutant, a huge insectoid creature. It moves in a crouch, its back arched and scaly, with huge knobbly vertebrae. The controlling overlord, the Marshal, has ordered all such mutants killed instantly. What was happening to the people of Solos? Why are they gradually turning into monsters? Hands that become claws, flesh that turns scale-like. When Doctor Who meets the Marshal and Jaeger, he realizes that all is not as it appears to be. The Marshal has a sinister plan to gain control of this planet, and Doctor Who must save Solos from this mad Earthman, as well as save the Solonians themselves. Count the Mutants as one of those stories that I thought was going to be great because I read the novelization first. When I finally saw the TV version, it came as a disappointment compared to the book. Poor acting in many parts of the story, a heavy reliance on CSO effects that looked dated even in the late 1980s, let alone today. I revisited the Terrance Dicks novelization in conjunction with the story's original DVD release. I turned straight to the audio commentary, which I had not listened to in over a decade. Nicholas Pegg was the moderator on this one. I was actually on a Target Books panel with Nicholas Pegg at a Gallifrey 1 in Los Angeles several years ago. I think this was 2017 when I was still updating the blog from which this podcast derives. Really nice guy, Nicholas. Would love to have him on here at some point. The audio commentary that he moderates is wonderful. So many people in the audio booth that day are no longer with us. Director Christopher Barry, co-writer Bob Baker, and script editor and novelization author Terrence Dix. Terrence, on the audio commentary, explained that everything we took for granted about the story's politics, the overt political message, the parallels with other Pertwee stories set during the Future Earth Empire, was not intended by the production team. He even drops a Samuel Goldwyn quote, which I'm sure he mentioned on several other Pertwee-era DVD audio commentaries as well. If you want to send a message, use Western Union. He says they weren't concerned with politics, even while everyone else in the booth for episode 1 agrees that this is a story with a large number of political elements. Indeed, the politics in episode 1 alone are so clear that I think Ron DeSantis is trying to get this story banned in the state of Florida. What could be more critical race theory than future kind Earth in the year 3000 having segregated transmat booths for humans, or as they're called in the story, overlords, and the native Solonians? The Marshal shoots mutated Solonians for sport. Climate change is thought to be behind the mutations on Solos. And there's talk about the end of Empire. Check that. Lots of talk about the end of Empire.
It's running amok. Good heavens, man, we're not at war with the Solonians. We're giving them independence.
Oh, eventually.
Not eventually, Marshal, now. Total and absolute independence. We're pulling out.
Pulling out?
I take it you've been too busy with security to study the latest reports from Earth. We can't afford an empire anymore. Earth is exhausted, Marshal, finished. Politically, economically, and biologically finished.
And why go back? We could keep Skybase on Solos, take over the whole planet.
Out of the question. Apart from the Solonians themselves, there's the problem of the atmosphere.
Well, they're both problems that can be solved.
Kai's already making political capital out of your experiments in that field.
The mutants.
Exactly.
There is no proof that my atmospheric experiments have anything at all to do with these mutations. The Mutts are a menace that must be wiped out.
And that's your alternative to independence? Genocide?
Give them independence, they'll starve out of total incompetence.
Nevertheless, they shall have their independence, whether they're ready for it or not.
When you summoned this conference, Administrator, I assumed you'd follow your usual line.
Which is?
Fob them off with promises, a few minor concessions. It's always worked before.
Well, this time I'm conceding all Kai's demands.
But
we have no choice. We must return to Earth.
But I put years of my life into this planet. My whole career.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid things are going to be a bit tricky for ex-colonial officials. Still, don't worry, old chap. We'll find you something. The Bureau of Records, perhaps. Something clerical.
While Terrence may have tried to disclaim the story's political overtones, insisting that he just wanted to tell a good story, the DVD info text production notes tell a very different tale, that the original script by Bob Baker and Dave Martin was in some respects unworkable, and that most of the plot twists and set pieces that we get in the televised story were added by Terrence himself. So that means one could argue that Terrence made this story more political, not less. Bob Baker on the DVD audio commentary booth certainly embraces the politics. So I was very curious how Terrence would handle all the politics for the novelization. This book came out 11 and a half months before Ron DeSantis was born, by the way. Clearly, if Ron had watched The Mutants as a child, and it's very unlikely that he did, Florida might be a very different place today. Regrettably, the book is a little less strident than the script. Now, stripped of some of the less successful acting choices and given an unlimited design budget of the mind, and in the hands of the writer who accidentally or not contributed so much to the final script, The Mutants is very strong in some places. The surface of Solos, the 30th century Earth colony, looks a lot better on the page than it did on the screen, even with DVD remastering. Dix tells us it was a planet of jungles, hot, dense, steamy tropical jungles, filled with a thin, choking mist that drifted eerily between knotted tree trunks, festooned with dangling vines. Christopher Barry probably wished, had he read this, that the film locations had been this evocative. I'm assuming that Terrence was either describing the original scripts, which the BBC didn't have the funds to fully realize, or just adding wishful thinking. Also, whereas the linking transmat stations on the ground on Solos and in orbit on Skybase are identical on TV, in print the former station is more realistically a concrete hut, lacking the grandeur of the ones on Skybase. There's an interesting change to the mythology on page 10 of the book. Rather than give his usual macro text about the Third Doctor's exile to Earth after being put on trial by the Time Lords, Terrence, now 9+ years after the War Games, says the Time Lords, quote, had exiled the Doctor to Earth for some unknown reason. He also explains the three-line whip reference by having the Doctor add, in your Parliament. Terrence on page 13 inadvertently others the Solonians by noting that Kai and Varen's tribes were hereditary enemies, and says the Solonians had a long tradition of war amongst themselves. Stubbs on page 15 adds, touchy lot these Solonians, always at each other's throats, and a sky-based security guard is made nervous by, quote, these wild, sword-waving Solonians. When the native Solonians begin to mutate, Terrence imbues them with symptoms far more gruesome than those portrayed on TV. Quote, sufferers sometimes went into a kind of berserk rage, killing everyone in their path. Then this is written in a chapter entitled Mutant on the Loose, no less, exclamation point in the original. When Varen, the Solonian native duped into working for the Earth imperialists, begins to go mutant himself, Terrence notes that he desperately fought to hold on to his own personality. This line gives Varen a dignity somewhat lacking from the on-screen performance of the late James Mellor. While the chief baddie, the Marshal, the Earth-appointed provisional governor of Solos, is best remembered for Paul Whitson-Jones's outsized, blustery performance, Terrence does give us needed backstory. He says the Marshal, quote, had come to Solos many years ago as a lowly security guard. Step by step he had fought his way to the position of Marshal, with supreme power. The Doctor, wonderfully, thinks of the Marshal internally as a brute and a bully, with the temper of a rogue elephant. Now how awesome is that characterization? Here's a quote from page 23 of the book. Alone, the Marshal looked round the enormous office with its massive semicircular desk. He looked at the mural behind it, showing Earth dominating a cluster of lesser planets. The Marshal loved his office. It was the symbol of his power. Now, while I enjoy these elaborations from the TV, I will point out this is a 6-part adventure crammed into a 121-page book. No matter how small the print or wide the margins are, it does, as a novelization, have less texture than some of the more lavish 135-page Terrence novelizations of 4-part TV adventures that we've explored earlier this year, like Brain of Morbius, episode 33, or Claws of Axos, episode 31. Again, Terrence does not combine or rearrange multiple short scenes into longer single sections. As a result, the book is full of very short sections, and a lot of TV scenes are either condensed from multiple lines of dialogue into a few, or are missing a couple of stray lines here or there. Jeffrey Palmer's cleverly written speech in episode 1, for example, is reduced to one single paragraph. The administrator was getting into stride now, droning his way through a rather flowery summary of the long history of Earth-Solos relations. Varen and the pro-Earth Solonians listened respectfully, but Kai and his supporters were becoming steadily more impatient. Kai began making rude and intentionally audible comments. When the administrator blandly ignored him, Kai began a chant of freedom now, freedom now, freedom now. His supporters took up the cry, and soon the administrator's voice was almost drowned out by the chanting. Now that's an effective paragraph, but it sells short Jeffrey Palmer's delivery of the actual speech on TV, which I think is some terrific work. Let's give a listen to what Jeffrey Palmer actually said.
Some 500 years ago, we Earthmen, overlords, as you call us, arrived on Solos. Our ancestors, yours and mine, made a solemn treaty, a pact, a bond, an act of friendship and mutual cooperation between our two peoples. A bold concept. Two different cultures, far apart in terms of development, uniting together to create a new society, a new and richer world. Now, after 500 years of expert scientific and technical aid, we have steered you to the verge of disaster, to the verge of independence.
Now, compared to the novelization of The Claws of Axos, which is the first time Terrence adapted a Baker and Martin script, This is a longer TV story, but it's condensed into fewer pages. There is not as much room for Terrence's trademark political wrangling. The Doctor's comment in episode 1 about the segregation of the transmat capsules, for example, does not appear in the book. Now, Terrence hits his marks when he needs to. Like in the Doctor's one meeting with Palmer's administrator, the Doctor reflects, typical bureaucrat, hates anything to disturb his nice routines. And Varen's son is given a name, Vorn, though you won't need to know that after about page 35 or so. Terrence also covers for the TV budget and its need to repurpose single rooms for multiple utilities. On page 27, he tells us, almost certainly rolling his eyes to himself, so large was the marshal's office that it could easily double as a small conference hall on occasions such as this, the conference where the Solonians are supposed to be granted their independence. In Chapter 4, slyly, Jaeger, the marshal's pet mad scientist, played on TV by Czech actor George Pravda, is said to have an accent so thick as to be almost impenetrable. Jaeger, or as I incorrectly said earlier in this recording, Jaeger, gets much needed backstory. A nasty scandal over research results, stolen from a junior colleague, had led to Jaeger's fleeing Earth and entering the marshal's service. When Jaeger, too dumb to realize the Doctor is turning his equipment into a bomb, gets temporarily knocked unconscious, the marshal on TV calls it a booby trap. In the novelization, Terrence adds the witty follow-up line, "And you were the booby." Terrence, as usual, gives the Doctor near mythic qualities. As Jo is rescued from yet another imprisonment, she observes, "How like the Doctor to pop up out of nowhere, just when everything seemed hopeless." However, a line reserved to describe the Doctor's charisma is here reallocated to Stubbs, the Marshal's rebellious lieutenant, when he tells his former colleagues to lay down their arms. Quote, "Such was the authority in his voice that the guards obeyed." This is one of the few times that Terrence gives the line to somebody else who is not the Doctor. The best way to sum up Doctor Who and the Mutants as a novelization is by observing Terrence's handling of the cliffhanger to episode 5. Jo, along with Professor Sondergaard and Cotton and Kai, is trapped in an airlock that's about to be flooded with deadly radiation. On TV, Cotton, a well-meaning character whose actor we discussed earlier, exclaims, "We'll all be done for." In the corresponding passage in the novelization, that line is excised. Freed from the constraints of an overextended TV budget, Doctor Who and the Mutants is, as Carl and Rosemead told me earlier, the best of Doctor Who, and something less than the best of Doctor Who. At its best, it elevates a TV production that after 50 years no longer represents the best of the classic series, but it preserves the elements of a script that really does represent everything good about the Pertwee years: strong politics, plot twists, and an intriguing 6-part story structure that in my opinion never flags. At its less than best, the novelization is noticeably abridged from the TV version. It doesn't breathe the way Terrence's earlier 1977 books breathed. Terrence handles the denouement in a couple of paragraphs, but I prefer the TV version of the same scene, which is a little bit longer and gives a little bit more meat for the actors. Let's listen to one more audio clip.
Professor Sondergaard has agreed to stay on Solos and see as many of the Solonians as possible through to the stage that Kai has already achieved.
But what about the others? The mutants we saw in the caves?
They were premature mutations, Jo. The cycle of changes was triggered off too soon. Rather like butterflies that hatch out on a cold spring day. Their instincts were too confused to seek out and use the crystal.
And now you think you'll be able to help them?
Oh yes, we think so. Kai is on Solos now, and with the crystal, we hope he can save them.
And what are you going to do, Cotton?
Give Kai and Professor Sondergaard all the help I can. Try and clear up some of the mess the Marshal made. Then, do something we should have all done a long time ago.
What's that?
Go home, miss. Back to Earth.
Exactly. Cotton, you will assume acting command of this base, pending its return to Earth.
Sir?
I take it you will be returning in Hyperion with me. I still require a full account of your involvement in this affair.
Yes, of course, but I wonder whether you'd excuse us for the moment, Investigator. My assistant is feeling rather faint.
Oh. Who, me? No, I'm fine now, honestly.
Yes, Jo,
I didn't feel too
you
good
have
earlier,
been
but
rather overdoing it, you know.
I
and
have?
You don't look too well.
Really?
Come on, yeah. Will you excuse us? We'll see you all later.
Who, did you say?
In retrospect, of course, it might have been a good thing that Terrence removed that Doctor Who joke from the novelization. While The Mutants as a book flies by, with better visuals, and with Terrence at times painting a superior word picture to Christopher Barry's best efforts, I was also, quite frankly, a little disappointed at this point in the novelization's publication run. It's Terrence without the time to do all of his usual world building, and the book's politics are not quite as strong and decisive as the Baker and Martin TV scripts. It is a fun book, but alas not, in my opinion, Terrence's definitive one. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, it's October 1977. In the Bronx, New York, which was burning at the time, Reggie Jackson's 3 home runs on 3 pitches in Game 6 propelled the Yankees to their 21st World Series title. The New York City mayoral race was heating up, but Son of Sam's recent arrest had cooled the temperatures, and the infamous summer blackout, one of my earlier memories, was a fading memory for most New Yorkers. Over in the target line, another electoral race is heating up, that for the presidency of Gallifrey. For the first time, Target was adapting a season 14 story and the third Robert Holmes script to be novelized in 6 months. This one is a doozy, a corker, and Doctor, 9 out of 10. Join me and a returning guest next week for the oh-so-political, oh-so-timely Doctor Who and the Deadly Assassin. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host, and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Denise Sutton. So lovely. Looking forward to having her back real soon. This podcast can be found on iTunes and Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature at gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.